A big pleasure for me is to introduce our speaker, Kim Czajkowski, well known to members of our society who will all have been receiving their journals, Strata, on an annual basis. And I know that many members turn first to the reviews section, where they will have noted that Kim has been the extremely expert and brilliant editor of Strata, the Strata Reviews section for the past few years, and has in fact just handed over that task. But apart from that, she is now becoming a rising star, may I say, in the field of Roman Jewish history and Roman legal history and Jewish studies of the Second Temple period and beyond in Judea and in the Jewish world. Kim is a senior lecturer in ancient history in the classics department at the University of Edinburgh. She did a DPhil in Oxford under Martin Goodman, and her research is focused on the legal history of the Roman Near East. Her book is called Localized Law, the Babatha and Salome Komaise Archives. That was published in 2017, and she's co-editor of a volume with broader remit, Law in the Roman Provinces, which came out this year. It is out, is it, Kim?
Yes, it is out.
Oh, well, I must
finally and thankfully.
Well, congratulations, that's very good. Kim has been working on a range of different things recently, but she's going to talk to us about the area of her very great expertise, and her lecture is called Reapproaching the Babatha Archive. Kim.
Thank you very much, Tessa, indeed. Right, I will attempt to do the technical thing first and share my screen before starting so that hopefully, can everyone see that? Perhaps Tessa or Anthony can tell me if that's visible. Because
yes, it is. I'm just going to try and go into full screen mode, but it's certainly visible.
Excellent, good.
Perfect.
I can't see you, so you will have to shout if anything goes wrong. Thank you very much, both Anthony and Tessa, both for the invitation and for that very, very kind introduction, Tessa. And I'm delighted to be speaking today. This is a somewhat, I have to say, it's a somewhat odd experience doing this via Zoom, but I will attempt to make it work, and I will attempt to speak slowly and clearly so that you can all hear me. It's also rather nice to actually come back to Babatha a bit, since I've been doing other things for the last couple of years, so it's been a very nice opportunity to sort of revisit the papyri. In addition to that, I know that we've got some extreme experts on this archive itself in the audience today, Hannah being one, Philip Esler as well. And so the kind of charm of a public lecture is that I'm speaking to a broader audience, but that might mean that there is not quite enough for the real specialists, but conversely, perhaps there's a little too much for the non-specialists. So I hope that I get the balance right, but if you would like any clarifications, then please do ask during the questions. Okay, so in 1961, during a series of controlled excavations of the Judean Desert caves, Yigael Yadin and his team found a purse in the Cave of Letters. And just so that you can all orientate yourself, this is the area we're talking about. We're onto the western coast of the Dead Sea with Nahal Haber. And you can see there in the kind of left-hand corner of the screen, the marker of the Cave of Letters on that coast, so fairly near En Gedi. And these are the caves that we're talking about. This is the Cave of Letters, which is around about 300 feet below the desert plateau and about 650 above the valley floor, so quite high up. The images courtesy of various kind of open source on the internet. I think the one from Wikicommons was actually from the Israel Antiquities Authority originally, but is through there. The purse itself that was found as it turns out, was filled with around 35 papyri and a few fragments as well that belonged to a Jewish woman called Babatha and her family. Now, Babatha lived in a village called Maoza on the southern coast of the Dead Sea, so we're talking about here. A village that was first part of the client kingdom of Nabataea, but was annexed by the Romans in 106 CE, becoming the province of Roman Arabia. Now, Babatha's family documents date from both before this period of annexation, so before the Romans took over the area, and afterwards as well. And so the implications for studying the effects of direct Roman rule on small communities should be, and indeed were, very immediately apparent. Now, Babatha's documents were not the only papyri that came out of the so-called Cave of Letters. This cave also produced the Bar Kokhba letters and leases, some indeed signed by Simon ben Kossipa himself, which I'm not going to talk about today. But there is also another Jewish family archive that is commonly named after the woman to whom many of the documents belonged, so Salome Komaise, which originated from this same cave, though was not found in controlled excavations. And this is much, much smaller than the Babatha archive. Now, the two women's archives are quite similar in nature. They consist of legal and administrative paperwork, including deeds of sales, marriage-related contracts, sometimes just labeled marriage contracts. I'll come back to that later, why I've sort of turned them like this. Deeds of gift, deposits, which are used for various different legal transactions, property declarations to do with the census, and two disputes that were aimed at the court of the Roman governor, which are a series of petitions, summonses, and so forth. The archives are both at least trilingual, so they include whole documents or subscriptions written in Greek, Nabataean Aramaic, Jewish Palestinian Aramaic, and some of the Greek looks like it is translations or renderings of documents which were originally in Latin as well, so you can throw that in too. The two families who are documented seem to have known each other, and many of the same people appear in the documents, either listed as neighbours when parcels of property are described, or indeed signing subscriptions as witnesses, so you can sort of trace the mutual connections at least. And this also sometimes occurs when people sign on behalf of the people who are unable to write for themselves. Now, just for avoidance of doubt, these are definitely archives belonging to Jewish families. So there are a preponderance of Jewish names that belong to the families themselves. I've given you just two of the kind of family trees. First is from Babatha's second marriage, because she was married twice. So we could also trace even further with this. And indeed, we can go down to her son, who is sort of involved in various of the paperworks here, and go up via her first marriage as well, which is not on here. And then also Salome Komaise and the various people we know from there, sometimes just half names preserved in the documents because they're fragmentary and so on, but you can see some of the people involved. In addition to this, the cave where the documents were found was one that was used by Jews as a refuge after the Bar Kokhba revolt. And indeed, nearby En-Gedi was a stronghold of the forces, and the fact that Babatha's second husband, Judah, owned property in En-Gedi may have been one reason that she chose to flee to these particular caves, even though he was dead by then, but we can possibly posit connections. Indeed, the reason that the documents were found in the caves, miles away from the women's own village, seems to be that they fled there when the revolt broke out, taking their paperwork with them. And the last document in the archive states to just before the revolt's beginning. In one document, Babatha's son is also explicitly described as a Judaios. This is in Pleiadian 12, which is sort of an extract from the minutes of council in Petra. And Babatha's Ketubah, Pleiadian 10, to her second husband Judah, is indeed an early example of what looks like a very typical Jewish Ketubah that we have examples of later as well. However, so we're definitely dealing with Jewish families who seem to have very good relations with their non-Jewish neighbours. So Nabataeans and Romans are also in evidence in the archives with very little sign of tension, and we might not expect to find any tension if there were there in this type of document. Judah, Babatha's second husband, borrows money from a Roman centurion in one document, for example. This is P.D. 811. And once upon a time, this was thought to be evidence of a kind of usurious squeeze in the amount of interest and adding on a lump sum. I think Philip Esler has entirely disproven that, so it seems to be a perfectly normal transaction, in normal rates of interest, etc. And among the guardians of the various wards in the archive, because we have a couple of so-called orphaned children where the mother survives but the father doesn't, we have 2 Jews, 1 Nabataean, and 1 woman with what looks like a Roman-sounding name, though Talilan has done some excellent prosopographical work on her, so Julia Crispina. Furthermore, the documents frequently attest both Nabataeans and Jews acting as active parties to transactions, or offer a combination of Nabataean and Jewish names as witnesses or subscribers to the documents. So Babatha and Salome Komaise's circle of acquaintances therefore appears to have very regularly encompassed non-Jews, if we're trying to sort of set out the environment in which these documents are being drawn up. Nevertheless, because we're dealing with Jewish families as owner of the archives themselves, it originally surprised, or at least was thought worthy of note, some scholars that the documents in the archives are in no way a clear-cut example of early Jewish law. And this is, after all, the century leading up to the Mishnah, to the redaction of the Mishnah in 200 CE-ish. In fact, the legal diversity of the archives is remarkable, with explicit references being made to Jewish and Hellenic law, and Roman legal formulae in various forms frequently in evidence. So just to give you an example, one very, very famous one. So I will come to another Roman legal formula later, but this is one document that was found in the archives, which is an actio tutelae, so an action on guardianship. Now, oddly enough, this document was copied out 3 times, so we have 3 copies of it in Babatha's archive. As you can see, it's undated, though we think it's related probably to a dispute that she was having with the guardians of her orphan son. And you can see from this, actually, to outsiders, this is probably one of the more boring documents of the archive, because it's not people complaining about each other, asking for sort of extra maintenance and so on. But from a legal perspective, it's very interesting indeed. This is a blank formula, Roman formula, that is nonetheless rendered in Greek. And it, as I said, it's an actio tutelae. It lays out kind of the bounds for action. We've got various adaptations, we think, to a provincial context. So we've got the names being laid out in what's called peregrine forms, so non-Roman citizen forms. So plaintiff X, son of Y, if we go with the translation for now, and determines sort of the action that can be taken regarding guardianship. Now, Hannah Cotton has written extensively on this particular case and points out, in fact, that if we're thinking about the actions available to Babatha under Roman law, it's not entirely clear that she would have been able to use this. However, she has 3 copies of this, again, blank, even though she's had found someone to get hold of this, to have it copied out. She's stored the paperwork very carefully. The names have not been filled in to relate to the actual case, for example. You've got various technicalities like xenokritae there, which I've left untranslated, which are a type of judges. Likely, I mean, if we follow Dieter Nuhr's work afterwards, probably recuperatores, that's actually disputed. There are a couple of translations that we can go with. But we've got then someone who has been able to copy this out, possibly translate it from the Latin original, though it is also possible that this was circulated, very Roman form, in Greek in the provinces. And that means that this may have been copied down, for example, from the edict of the governor in the provinces, or indeed it may have originated from a kind of handbook of this type of formulae, or from useful forms that was circulating in the Roman province at that particular time. And again, provincials have decided to go and find out about this and to use it because they thought that it would be relevant to them, or that it might be useful to know what seemed to be the Roman rules on this, or what the Romans would be thinking of in terms of guardianship. So that's very, very sort of brief summary of an absolutely fascinating document that we can always come back to and on which much has been written. Now, if you take examples like this, coupled with the fact that the documents date from the very vital transition period during which the Nabataean Kingdom came under direct Roman rule, the various laws of the archives and legal references have deservedly received a very large amount of scholarly attention. And indeed, this has been where the bulk of literature on the archives has been written. So as I mentioned, Hannah Cotton has dedicated a great many articles throughout the 1990s, early 2000s, and I know she also had another one recently in 2017, to studying various aspects of the archives, mainly on the legal side, but some others as well. Other notable contributions are, of course, Ranon Katsov and David Shaps's 2005 edited volume, and then the prolonged study of the laws of the documents by Jacobine Augusthorn in 2007. And then in recent years, both myself and Philip Esler have also contributed further monographs on the documents. Professor Esler's focusing more on the Nabataean era papyri, mine more on the Roman era and effects of annexation. So we've thus reached the situation where if we take the two archives together, so Babatha and Salome Komaise, we've got sort of a little bit over 40 papyri, have stimulated numerous articles, an edited volume, and 3 monographs so far. And that's a rather impressive scholarly output, especially when we think of the tens and tens and tens of thousands of papyri that come from Egypt, for example. Though, of course, other individual or archive documents have also generated quite concerted concentration too. But what I wanted to do in this lecture is essentially give you an idea of why this is the case, why they've got so much attention, and think a little bit about what we can learn from Babatha's documents. My concentration is on understanding a bit more about how law functioned in practical terms, how people may have found out about the options available to them and got their business done. And I think you can take that and think a bit more about how law operated in the provinces more generally. So still the bulk of scholarly concentration in the now nearly 50 years since the archive's discovery, even though they were not published in full until much later, has been on identifying certain legal systems or operative law of the archives, and in some cases have yielded very different conclusions. Now, this kind of approach involves a very careful consideration of individual legal formulae and their possible parallels in various bodies of law, be that Roman, Jewish, or rabbinic, sometimes aligned together, though sometimes separated out, or indeed the law of papyri in Egypt. The assumption which lies behind all this is that we can then detect the operative law or legal system in which the parties intended to operate from a close examination of the document's phrasing and their diplomatics, so their outside appearance as well, the way that they're set out. Such studies are incredibly illuminating and tell us about the complexity of the papyri, the sheer diversity of legal phraseology, spheres and traditions which could and indeed did combine, sometimes even within a single contract. Though, despite all this, there has been a great deal of controversy over indeed which operative law or legal system prevailed in the archives. Certain individual documents have been the subject of particularly fierce debate. Now, we can take the marriage documents as a case in point to which I'll come back later, but just very, very briefly initially. So there are 3 examples of these across the 2 archives, 2 written in Greek and 1 in Jewish Aramaic. Now note, these are not the only contracts to have come, the only marriage-related contracts to have come out of the Judean Desert, but these are the 3 from those particular archives, which I'm taking because we can think about that within a particular community. So it's a concentrated geographic location where these were taking place, but there are other marriage documents as well. Now, aside from quite a variety of legal formulae that are found in these contracts, particularly the Greek documents, these have attracted much attention in part because of their explicit reference to various different laws or customs. The translation often of nomoi varies, a feature that is not generally found in the other documents in the archives. There is one other reference particularly to the law of deposit, but the kind of specific references to laws is fairly unusual. And you can see here, I've given you a rough sample. So we have in the Jewish Aramaic ketubah between Babatha and her second husband Judah, a reference to him taking her as a wife according to the law of Moses and the Judeans. Should be plural there, apologies, it's a mistake on the PowerPoint. And then in Piyadin 18, which is between Judah's daughter Shalamzion and another Judah Kimba, we have a reference to taking a wife according to the laws, and indeed then later in accordance with Greek custom. And then we also have another, which is another in P. Haber 65. So this is Salome Komaise and Yeshua, which is in accordance with Greek custom and Greek manner. And explicit references like these do not then make the documents any more straightforward, because we can then debate, for example, whether these clauses apply, whether these particular references apply to the entire document or indeed just to particular clauses. If you go with according to the laws in Piyadin 18, that has been variously interpreted as referring to quote, their customary laws, and then i.e. Jewish law, but then also we have another reference, as you can see, to Greek, and translated here as custom, nomos, possibly law as well. So this may be a little bit unclear. The function of the documents as well has been disputed. So, for example, it was suggested at one point that Piyadin 18 was a Greek version of a document related to the marriage, and there would have been another Aramaic contract, which is now lost to us, which resembled the Ketubah. I don't entirely go along with that, because I think actually, given the unity of find, then this would be the one place where we'd expect to have that, but it is possible. That then changes the nature of what you think that particular Greek contract is doing, and so on. So that's a sort of glimpse in that specific references to specific laws or specific customs does not necessarily solve the problem of the so-called operative law or legal system in place within these documents. And I can mention, for example, Jacobin Alpsthorn and Ranon Katsev were very much staunch advocates of a Jewish framework, even for the Greek contracts in particular, and others have gone for other interpretations. Now, this kind of work of comparing and looking across these kind of formulae, comparing across with Egyptian papyri in particular and other Jewish contracts, should definitely be done. But what we also need to think about is a little bit more about the practical processes of drawing up these papyri from the perspective of the people involved in using these documents. Now, what this might yield is actually a more kind of subjective, perspective-based picture of the operation of laws in the archives. But we also then think about the influences and the various kind of negotiations involved in getting to the point where the document was written. So the emphasis shifts to how people are understanding law and their own legal activities, if indeed they're properly understanding them at all. We think about people's motivations for going to law in the first place and how they went about doing so. Agency, situation, and context are therefore key. Now, this is a vital consideration in view of what we know about the operation of law in the provinces throughout the empire at this time. So this is before the era of widespread codifications of Roman law, and it's around the time when we're beginning to see some formative and fundamental shifts in the way that law operated and indeed was formed in the Roman Empire, with provincials at the periphery putting pressure on the centre that then in turn can lead to Roman judges having to accommodate varied understandings of the law, both local and sometimes Roman. Now, indeed, this development fits in with broader moves in Roman history and understandings, let's say, in the mirroring of debates on Romanization, which is now a banned term among many people, but was much criticized for implying a kind of sort of one-way, unidirectional idea of Rome imposing its culture on the provinces. I think newer understandings of this, even in the last 20 years or so, have fully emphasized this kind of dynamic process, that it's two-way, that Rome imposes something, but provincials also push back, and you get this kind of merging or reinvention and dialogue in terms of how areas become incorporated into the province. Clifford Ando, for example, reformulates this a little bit in terms of imperial identities, which can also be useful. But law is no exception to this kind of dialogue and kind of interaction when we see it in its historical and historical context. And I've pointed here to certain developments that have come out in some recent work. Now, I pointed to Ari Bryan's article in Law and History Review, which sort of lays out some of the dynamics involved in this. So what we have, to put this bluntly, provincials, particularly in the first and then into the second century, begin to understand, let's say, the rules of the game and manipulate them to their advantage. So they start to take advantage of, let's say, possible spaces in understanding in a provincial context, and then try to use that to exert their own understanding of their legal position on Roman judges. This leads to various developments. First, we get increasing kind of references to precedents to previous decisions in the papyri, and indeed arguments from tradition. But what we also see is increasing use of paperwork as well, and the spread of legal forms. So people, when they're putting in petitions to Roman judges, will include past decisions, or they might include opinions of nomikoi, of legal experts, and so on. And the use of paperwork and spread of paperwork is facilitated by certain Roman mechanisms. So we have, for example, the use of archives, and also the growing kind of number of collections of handbooks, which seem to have been gathered and in circulation as well. So we have this on the part of the Roman administration, but also provincials really using this to their advantage, that they then develop and exert their own understandings of law that the Romans have to cope with. And we see this, I've mainly referred to the east. You can go further west. So if we go to Dacia, for example, you have slave sales where peregrines, non-Roman citizens, seem to be using particular Roman forms. So something called mancipatio, and they'll combine it with traditio, which are two very different forms of sort of handing over property. And the first of these, mancipatio, should only be used by Roman citizens or by peregrines with certain rights. And this doesn't seem to be the case for those who are using them there in Dacia. So you get peregrines using these forms, even though technically they're not allowed to, but this becomes conventional in the area and accepted, and just becomes the way of selling a sale, even though perhaps it's not technically right. And thus they seize Roman legal instruments, understand it in a certain way, and use these for their own advantage. So similar examples, getting back to Babatha, can be found in Babatha's archive, and I'll take just one. So this is Piadine 17. Now, this example of a document that I've used because it is something that should in some ways not have much to do with the Roman administration. This isn't a document which is aimed at a complaint to be judged by a Roman judge. This is a contract that is a deposit contract, typically labelled for very good reason. The word is used throughout the contract, where Judah, so Babatha's second husband, acknowledges that he has received from her 300 denarii. So this is a contract between husband and wife. As you can see, this is written in Greek. And we see that Judah confirms that he's received the money, and so on. So the interpretations of the motivations behind this contract have varied. Deposit was quite a flexible contract in antiquity. So we have, for example, it seems to have been the case that soldiers used it to sort of hide dowries because they weren't supposed to get married, and so they put it in the form of deposit instead. And so on. And you can see the flexibility in that there's no date by which the loan has to be paid back. Babatha may call it in at any time, for example, if we understand this as a loan, which most people have done. Some have said that actually this is very straightforward, and all that has happened is Babatha has handed over a sum of money to her husband for safekeeping. There are various corollaries to this, in that the sum turns up later as well, so it may be that Judah needed the money, and so on. But okay, so there has been a sum of money handed over between husband and wife, and this is documented in Greek. We then have at the end of this contract this funny little phrase. So, in good faith, the formal question was asked, and it was agreed in reply that this is thus rightly done. Now, what this is called cautio. So, it is a written record of something called stipulatio. Now, this is a formal question and answer that consists of a formal pledge. It's originally a verbal contract in form, but then we increasingly find sort of these records written down because you record things. Originally, it was a formal, and the verbs had to match. So in Latin, you might say spondes, spondeo. Okay. Though this gradually becomes more relaxed, so we know from Gaius that it didn't then have to be just in Latin, it could be in Greek as well, and so on. And you can see here the form. And it is used not only in this document, in Babatha's archive, but it's used in several others as well. And I've given you the list here. So it's used in some of the marriage-related contracts, so P18 18 and P 65. It is used in a concession of rights, and it's used in what I've labeled here, sort of following the original publication, but it's very much disputed, the sale and purchase of a date crop. But this is also, the nature of these two documents is very odd, where this is some kind of sharecropping arrangement and so on, but it has this particular clause at the end. And these are the earliest examples that we have of this particular Roman legal form in an Eastern province, even though it comes to be used very, very widely in contracts all across the empire. And it comes to be used particularly, you can watch Egypt after the Constitutio Antoniniana, so the universal grant of citizenship in 212 CE, when suddenly one of the very clear effects of this is that the new Roman citizens in Egypt start adding stipulatio to almost all of their contracts, regardless of whether it is legally necessary or not. And indeed here, it seems in strict terms not to have been legally necessary, because the deposit that this is attached to was a perfectly good form in its own right. Okay, so this is somewhat redundant in legal terms, but it's added nonetheless. And this is added, as I said, to other contracts within the archives, so the marriage-related contracts and so on as well. So what we have in this document, to stick with P 17, is a contract between two intimates, a husband and wife, which is drawn up in Greek, thus not their native language, and Babatha at least is stated to be illiterate in Greek, that includes a rather notably Roman form. Neither of them wrote the document themselves. This should always be borne in mind. A liblarios, this one called Germanos, did. Thus, if we're thinking about sort of tracing decisions in order to get this contract drawn up, we have the decision to draw up a contract in a language that they, i.e. the principals, Babatha and Judah, appear not to have known, or at least not known well to the point of writing extensively in it. They also have the decision to include what looks like, let's say, a proper Roman marker at the end of their document. Now, this might have been that they then think that this would have looked good to a Roman authority, that this makes somehow the contract then operable under Roman law in general. We don't know, but this is a decision to include it and to formally document this transaction a private transaction between two intimates, husband and wife, to document and write down this handover of money. Now, this last point is key because it underlines one of the really significant points. So this is not a document that is any way aimed directly at being used within a Roman courtroom. And thus, naturally enough, if you're doing that, you would obey the conventions that you think that any judge in question would expect to be obeyed or would expect as customary. This is a fundamental shift in a private personal transaction within the Roman province, and it might tell us more about how such behaviours were shifting, with lots and lots of caveats involved. So who's available to write this contract, how do they find them, and so on, that we'll come to later. That we have family paperwork before and after the province is created is a nice unusual bonus compared with the evidence from elsewhere, in that we have access to micro-level changes that we can put in the context of the empire-wide shifts that I mentioned before. We can return to some of these questions later, but first, if we shift to some of the other documents within the family through the very famous example of the contracts related to marriage. Now, these are a nice additional window into some of those themes and problems precisely for the reason that they occupy this private legal space. So it's not directly related to dispute resolution at the point of drawing the contracts up, or not directed immediately at a Roman court. The Babatha and Salome Komaise archives offer us 3 contracts, as I mentioned before. So we've got Piyadin 10, Piyadin 18, and Pihaver 65. Now, just to take you through these very briefly, I would give you these, but there's a limit to what you can put on PowerPoint. And I would have just been throwing huge amounts of texts at you. So unfortunately, I can't just give you the whole documents, even though they're fascinating. So Piyadin 10 is the only document of these 3 which is written in Jewish Aramaic. It is Babatha's marriage contract to her second husband, Judah. The date, which would have been at the top of the papyrus, is unfortunately lost. There are remnants, but not of the year. Though from the information in the rest of the archive, we can probably place it in the mid to late 120s. It's probably between 124 CE and 128. 128 is the point at which Judah appears explicitly stated to be Babatha's husband, so it's got to be before then. But at any rate, for the avoidance of doubt, this is definitely Roman era. So we've got an Aramaic document when the majority of the papyri in these archives have turned to Greek, but this hasn't. It is definitely Roman era. It's notable for several reasons. First, it contains the only explicit reference in these archives to an act completed according to the law of Moses and the Judeans. Additionally, many of the clauses within the contract bear remarkable similarities to those that are later laid out in the Mishnah. So, for example, the specification of the amount due to the wife at the conclusion of the marriage, the promise of the husband to redeem her if she was taken captive, and so on. And to add to this, the papyrus is also the only one in these archives that is confirmed to have been written by one of the participants themselves, rather than, let's say, a hired hand or someone else, another writer. So Judah himself, the groom, writes this, meaning it constitutes a more direct attestation of the knowledge of one of the parties themselves, and not of some kind of advisor or scribe or intermediary, as we're dealing with for contracts such as Piyadin 17 that I gave you earlier. The 2 Greek contracts, at least at first glance, offer a stark contrast. So the first of these, Piyadin 18, is that of Shalamzion, Babatha's stepdaughter, and to a certain Judah Kimber, and it's in 128 CE. So not that far away from Babatha and Judah's own Ketubah. The opening formula of the document are strongly reminiscent of Greek marriage contracts. So you have the bride's father giving her away, in contrast to Judah, for example, taking Babatha as his wife, as is common in Ketubot. This is closely followed by the acknowledgement of the receipt of the dowry by Judah Kimber from her father. We've got dating formula that is very, very typical of the documents of the Roman era that are consular year and so on. We've got the stipulatio at the end, as you have seen, it's the document is written by 7 signatories and so on. There are also, as you saw earlier, 2 key references to nomos in the contract. So the first is simply to according to the laws without any further clarification. And the second is more specific in reference that says that it refers to Judah Kimber feeding and clothing his wife and any children in accordance with Greek custom or law, with Greek nomos. Okay. In the upper text, because the document is written out twice, it's double document. In the upper text, this little point with in accordance to Greek custom is actually added interlinear above the line, though it's not in the lower text. So it doesn't seem that we can make anything great after that, apart from maybe that the scribe forgot and just added it in afterwards, but it's fully within the lower text, so that's fine. Both of the Judahs, so Judah Kimber and Judah Shalamzion's father, sign and attest the document in Aramaic at the end, and I'll show you that in a bit. And there are, as I said, 7 signatures, 1 in Greek, the rest in Aramaic on the back. And we have the signature of the scribe, Theanos, son of Simon, who describes himself again as this Liblarios, so we know who the scribe was. And then if we get to Pihaver 65, this is 131 CE, so it's the latest of our 3 documents, and this is the marriage of Salome Komaise and Yeshua, son of Menachem. Dating formula as you would exactly expect, consular and provincial year. But then the contract seems to differ from Pleiadian 18, i.e. the other Greek document. Now, the beginning is fragmentary, though it doesn't seem like this began with the kind of giving away of the bride. Instead, what seems to have been the case, and I'm following Hannah's reconstruction instruction in this, is that the couple form an agreement, okay, to continue to live together vitally as also before this time. So they had been living together before and they continue to do so, and they are only now drawing up a document. Now, that is a significant point and a significant phrase that's been interpreted variously as either revealing a kind of unwritten marriage, agraphos gamos, which is known from Egypt already, which means that people are indeed married, but it's not written down. There is not a contract at the point at which the marriage is entered. It's also been suggested in the kind of, if you go with the Jewish interpretation of this, trying to accord this with Jewish law, as evidence of a Jewish custom of cohabitation before betrothal, when the bride is an orphan and a minor. Personally, I don't think this quite works here because the bride probably isn't a minor at this point, or indeed as evidence of premarital cohabitation as a local practice in 2nd century Palestine. That was by Talalan. Just to sort of further formal features, the groom confirms receipt of the dowries. It's paid as others are in feminine adornment. And then you also get again this provision to support the wife and any future children, this time in accordance with Greek custom and manner, nomos and Greek manner. And like the one before it, Pleiadian 18, we also have stipulatio at the end. Now, as may be evident from this, Pleiadian 10 has not quite attracted quite so much controversy as the Greek documents, which have been read either in terms of Greek marriage practice and legal institutions, usually in comparison with what we find in the Egyptian papyri, or through a kind of interpretatio Hebraica that places the contracts in line with specifically Jewish practice, often aligned with later rabbinic texts, even if the litigants are then adopting Greek formulaic language. What should be obvious, I hope, from sort of rather brief summary, is that the Greek contracts themselves, despite their similarities, are in fact far from uniform in nature. So this is not simply a case of two alternative legal contracts in two different languages, and nor is it particularly easy to classify this as sort of Jewish tradition versus just Greek tradition, regardless of how we come down in terms of interpreting the later documents. The kind of dichotomy implicitly plays as well, I think, into an uncomfortable suggestion that what is Greek cannot somehow be Jewish. Besides anything else, a Greek-Jewish dichotomy also skates over the inclusion of the highly Romanized elements, i.e. stipulatio. Possibly there's an assumption that Greek equates to Roman in this context, which would be very problematic. And indeed, even within these Greek language contracts, there could be some considerable variation. Thus, we can continue to debate under which legal sphere this places the contracts, but there are a series of side questions about legal life in this community onto which they can throw fascinating light. So how is such variation made available in the first place? Who knew about the different options available? And then how are they transmitted? So like with Pleiadian 17, and in line with this wider shift to thinking about provincial agency, this then means thinking more about the process by which these contracts came to be drawn up, the people involved, their interactions, the levels of legal knowledge they brought to the document's end form, and so on. And this can tell us a bit about the everyday mundane practical problems of getting one's legal business done in Maoza, that are vital in considering the operation of law more broadly, even if it doesn't solve the operative law question. Now, while we don't want to fall into this kind of Greek-Jewish opposition in terms of legal context, the linguistic component is an important point to note. So we shouldn't overlook the fact that we are indeed dealing with contracts in two different languages here, Jewish, Aramaic, and Greek. Pleiadian 18 also includes Jewish Aramaic subscriptions in the form of attestations by both Judas. So this is the groom and the father of the wife. And this is given to you here. So you can see this is the very end of the papyrus. So you have the Greek language contract right up until this point, and then the parties sign at the end, and they sign in their own native language. And then you have the reference by the attestation by the scribe at the end that he wrote it. And indeed, note that while Piyadin 10, as I mentioned, the Ketubah, was written by the groom himself in his native language, Piyadin 18 was written by this, we assume, some kind of professional writer, someone who was hired, Theana, son of Simon, who is known to have written 5 other documents in the archive as well. And there's no reason to think that any of the principals wrote Pihaver 65, so this is Salome Komaise's document themselves either. This generally fits within the ancient world. You hire professional writers to compose such documents. And Piyadin 10, this Ketubah, then becomes the exception to the rule. So what are the implications of this? First, we can't assume a priori that the parties to the Greek contracts were fully aware or fully in control of the legal niceties of their documents. Now, Judah is obviously literate in Jewish Aramaic, and the groom in Piyadin 18, Judah Kimber, is, apologies, I have lost my place, also seems to have been. It is possible, however, this was to a slightly more limited extent, since we only have fairly straightforward attestation written by him, not, as with Judah, Babatha's husband, a full contract. So we have to think in terms of levels of literacy and understanding here. But the literacy levels in Greek of these people are entirely unknown. Now, unknown and not non-existent should be emphasized. So it is very possible that people may have been able to write no Greek but read some, read only a little, or read none at all. They might be able to speak Greek but not read or write it, or indeed read or write possibly rather simple Greek but have chosen not to in these circumstances. Equally, however, knowledge of Greek for everyday purposes is an entirely different beast from drawing up a legal contract in the language. It is just a very different matter. Now, the same point can be made with regard to Judah's knowledge of Jewish Aramaic. Drawing up his own marriage contract presumes a rather different skill and knowledge set from those linguistic skills employed in day-to-day conversation. There are some nuances to this, particularly if you look at Piyadin 10, and I'm thinking of an article that actually Hannah wrote in 2017, which looks at this Barathurin formulation, which seems to be a rendering of a particular Greek term, gunagamete, into Aramaic, which might suggest that this kind of oscillized term has somehow worked its way in to this Jewish Aramaic contract. And you can also trace in Piyadin 18 the use of different Greek terms, so prospera to refer to the dowry, put it bluntly, but then in Aramaic, the term used seems to have been a rendering of the Greek fernet. So there were different technical terms being used in use and then being rendered into Aramaic in different ways, which means that we definitely need to note the levels of literacy, how much access people have to these documents, but not rule out some kind of perhaps spoken exchange, or that there is a transfer on a linguistic level in these ways. So this could definitely be looked at further. Thus, to get back, we need to entertain the possibility that many of the oft-disputed phrases in the Greek documents are often more down to scribal influences than to the parties themselves. Now, this is sometimes acknowledged, but the implications of this for discussing legal knowledge, the level of control, the input of the parties themselves, are not always fully emphasized. So writers, especially legal writers, have stock phrases. They have a technical vocabulary and a specialist knowledge, which they could and did bring to the documents that they composed. The end form of the document is as much going to be down to the writer's own specialist knowledge, vocabulary and skills as it is to the preferences of the parties who are employing them. Now, that's not to say that we then deny those parties any influence over their documents at all. The principals themselves do have an input. They have to explain the situation to their writers. express what they want done. Perhaps they want to express the particular authority to which they wanted to turn if there were later problems in any case. They might pick the language in which they wanted a document written and indeed choose which scribe to approach in the first place. For example, it seems to have been a definite choice to have Piyadin 18 and Pihaver 65 written in Greek. While our knowledge about Salome Komaise and Yeshua is more limited, we know that Judah could have drawn up a Jewish Aramaic contract not unlike his own for his daughter and son-in-law if he'd wanted to, and he didn't. Now, maybe this is because the couple themselves expressed a preference for the Greek language contract, we don't know. So illiteracy too does not deprive the parties of power. A document can indeed be read back or even verbally translated while it's being drafted and amended as requested. But that being said, we should acknowledge this extra filter in drawing up the documents and be willing to problematize the level of the parties' control over the exact phraseology of their own contracts, particularly when we place such weight on the interpretation of such phrases. Ultimately, these are products of a collaboration between writer and litigant, and that collaboration can actually help to explain the multi-legal features of the documents. Different skill sets, knowledge, and backgrounds met and interacted as the actors themselves did. Now, the normality of hiring writers and the frequency with which this was done makes the fact that Judah drew up his own marriage contract himself more significant. His writing has been described as that of a skill and practice writer, though he's not a professional, and he makes certain slips in drawing up his contract. So he repeats certain words and phrases in the course of composing it, which look a little bit like copyist areas, sort of repeating things across a line. Errors notwithstanding, however, this is no botched job, at least as far as we can tell, and it does show some considerable skill and indeed knowledge. There are then several possibilities to be explored here. The first is that, although not a scribe, Judah did have the relevant literacy skills and legal knowledge to draw up such a contract, and he did so. Errors noted a part of his unprofessional but still competent composition. This would then demonstrate a degree, and would say a high degree, of familiarity with those traditions and practices of writing a ketubah, and which later came to be included in Mishnaic regulations. But there is another possibility, namely that Judah was copying a model of some sort and changing the relevant details along the way. Now, the slips then become copyist errors. This was suggested actually by Michael Wise in a more general study of literacy in the Judean Desert documents. So Judah could have copied, he notes, from a handbook of notarial practice, we're back to handbooks, but this time in Aramaic, or from a ketubah in the family archives. Now, I would actually go for the ketubah kept within the family for several reasons. I think it is plausible that Judah had access to such a document. We know that he had another wife called Miriam. So you can see here the reference to this is after Judah has died, to my and your late husband. Okay. There has been something of an active dispute as to whether this is an attestation of polygamy among Jews or whether this is serial monogamy. I think actually for the purposes of the argument at the moment, it doesn't matter because you can still hypothesize a ketubah, but some have stuck staunchly to the idea that this was serial monogamy and that there may have been a divorce and then you married Babatha. I think it's probably more likely that we read this straightforward and it's polygamous, but I don't have a dog in that fight. In any case, it's plausible that Judah had access to this kind of document because indeed he may have had a ketubah from his previous marriage to Miriam. If Shalamzion is indeed his daughter by Miriam, as it's universally assumed, then it seems fairly certain that the marriage to Miriam came first and then to Babatha later. So, as you can see, Judah is referred to both Babatha and Miriam as my and your late husband. If we do assume that Judah is copying his own former contract or another model of some sort, this has some implications for our assessment of his personal knowledge of the relevant legal formulae. All this still means that there is some sort of expertise in this kind of tradition available in the community, but at least in drawing up Piyadin 18, he could simply have been copying a previous example. So to return to the Greek contracts, I will do that for a second. It's already been emphasized that these show significant differences in formulation, also perhaps purpose. While one seems to have been drawn up at the start of the marriage, this is P.D. 18, the couple were already living together, and I've already noted the difference in the opening formulations. The possibility has also been raised that P. 65 was simply something like a dowry receipt, and that's indeed why I've labelled these as contracts related to marriage, because whether they are indeed marriage contracts, what the kind of actual transformative purpose of that particular documented contract is disputed, so we'll go with the broad label. But there is at least more than one type of Greek contract available for use, which are actually employed by people in the community. Whether this could also suggest variety in how the institution of marriage itself is conceived in this region is another matter altogether, but it can at least be documented differently even within the Greek language. Now, the variation in how the contracts are drawn up then stands in contrast to the practice that we find in other types of contract from the same archives. So for example, if you go back to the Nabataean Kingdom and you look at sales contracts that are drawn up, these are much, much more standardized, and the level of variation is nowhere near as great as we find within marriage contracts in the archives in general, or even just between two Greek contracts related to marriage. And there are several factors that can explain this. The first is that there are just different practices and perhaps different attitudes towards different types of contracts. So sales of land, such as those contracted in the Nabataean era, were not so variable, and we would indeed expect that. So there is a tax that seems to have been payable to the Nabataean monarch on property such as those documented in the sales contracts, and this kind of requirement may have plausibly enough led people to use one more fixed forms that in transactions that did not require such a payment. Just the transfer of land in general may have let you go with a standardized form in the same way. Marriage, however, may have provoked rather different feelings altogether and could be an area in which different embedded indigenous customs met, conflicted, and had to be negotiated. We've already seen that different circumstances were included in Shalamzion and Salome's marriages, but this means that there are different possibilities for documenting a marriage in the first place and different contracts to meet the purposes. We can also think about different generational preferences, which could have played a part within the earlier period too, since this particular Jewish community was resident in the area under the Nabataean Kingdom. So there is indeed, it seems, kind of some plurality that exists here. If we're thinking about terms of sort of differences between generations, some have explained this in terms of Hellenizing tendencies of the younger generation. I think that's a slightly problematic label, unless you're using it in the very strict literal meaning of Hellenizing in the sense of writing in Greek language. If you're using it with a more culturally loaded term, we have to remember that some of these people, i.e. Judah Kimber, for example, are still writing themselves in Jewish Aramaic. So saying that they are fully Hellenized and so on is just perhaps not so obvious. If we're thinking in terms of P.D. 18, just putting the choice of a Greek contract down to the influence of the groom alone based on his Romanized name also seems somewhat unsatisfactory. As I said, he's a man who personally wrote in Jewish Aramaic, but these are possibilities to explore. Now, the other possibility is that the legal situation became rather more complex or more plural, if you like, after the Roman annexation, and that practices are changing to reflect that. So the base argument is that empire equals greater pluralism. More formulary models were in circulation, there are more options, and thus possibly also a greater uncertainty about the situation in general. Such uncertainties can include which authorities to consult or turn to in the case of problems, and how to go about doing so. To a certain extent, at least, this much must be true. The Romans were the new authority in the area, whose presence was likely to have taken into account by litigants, scribes, and advisors alike. New scribes and advisors could also have arrived with the new imperial authorities. But we should also note that Jewish families living in this area after the annexation had been living there in the Nabataean period too. And if we're considering the existence of specifically Jewish practices in the area, there's no reason to think that these appeared magically upon its provincialization. Thus, if we're positing multiple legalities after the annexation, so after 106, which includes some sort of Jewish indigenous practices in the mix, then we must surely take this into consideration as well with the earlier period, since this particular Jewish community was resident in the area under the Nabataean Kingdom. So we have a situation where there seems to have been some options in the Nabataean Kingdom as well. You have Jewish law tradition, whatever that is at this time. As I've said, this Jewish community seems to range across different traditions. You have Nabataean law, and then when the Romans come along, you add an extra layer. So you have potentially Roman law, but you also have a proliferation of Greek forms and Greek contracts as well. So you have options that then multiply. Now, while attributing greater legal pluralism to the Roman advent would certainly explain more options across different traditions, greater plurality within the same kind of this document in the same language is of even further significance for any assessment of level of legal expertise in the area. It's not just one single new option that's added to the mix, rather a variety of forms is becoming available. If the scribes who are writing these were connected to the Roman administration, as may have been the case for someone who is described as a liblarios, then we can posit a variety of formulae available within this province, or at least a level of legal expertise that went beyond one type of form for one type of transaction. And in a relatively new province, this is a significant point to note in tracing the extent and manner of the spread of legal knowledge. I've just seen the time, I promise I'm nearly done. The increase in plurality in the Roman period has further implications. Nabatea was still a client kingdom prior to the annexation, and as such had some sort of contact with the Roman imperial centre. Though this might have been limited in extent, it might have been more confined to royal household and associates, and so on. So on. I'd say probably trade and so on means this a bit wider. But the vital missing ingredient would have been the court of the Roman governor, which toured assize centres of the province, distributing justice to those who approached it when we get into Roman rule. Now, this is of course the ideal. In reality, this system was full of practical problems, including potentially high costs for litigants to travel to the assize centre and lengthy delays while they waited around, hoping their case would be heard. But if the more immediate presence of the Roman authorities, and indeed of a Roman court, is the crux in creating greater plurality, this has significant implications which need to be teased out. The court was there to adjudicate and settle disputes if approached. There isn't an obligation to do so. If peregrines, i.e. non-Roman citizens, did choose to have recourse to this particular legal forum, we might naturally expect that paperwork that was intended to be submitted to it would conform to whatever provincials thought were Roman expectations and preferences. That is just canny in terms of making your case. From their perspective, meeting such expectations would be sensible. When hoping to win a case, one would naturally try to conform as far as possible to the preferences of the judge in order to create a favourable impression. But marriage contracts are not bound up with such disputes, at least not initially. I mean, they might do later, they might come into it, but when initially they're drawn up, they're not. And as such, it's not immediately clear why the availability of a Roman court in and of itself would lead to a sudden plurality in different kinds of such contracts. Indeed, the fact that there were now such contracts written in Greek would suggest that even at the time of writing, provincials were looking ahead to potential problems and how these might have to be resolved. And I've put here potential points of early contract with the administration. So, we have this case, which I think was probably fairly formative in this, where Babatha versus the guardians of her orphaned son, which went to the Roman governor. So she has extensive contact with these institutions and possibly with the people, the scribes and so on involved as part of that case. We know that Judah, her husband, also had contact with a particular centurion where he took out a loan from him. There's an earlier contract which is rendered in Greek and is between an uncle and a nephew, though the fact that this is in Greek suggests some sort of contact, I think, with the Roman imperial authorities in translating it at least, or in depositing it perhaps in archives. So that's a possible point of contact. But if we're thinking of where things start to change, personal interactions with imperial institutions, this is the sort of thing that we're talking about. So if you're then choosing a Greek language contract, there's a kind of just in case mentality, just in case we need to have later recourse to a court which preferred Greek at a later date. And so even when not immediately anticipating the use of a particular legal forum, they opt to take into account its perceived linguistic and perhaps legal preferences right from the off, even in personal and private documents. And thus the Roman presence begins to influence the way that people conduct their legal business, even in contracts which should potentially never come to the Roman authorities. And these actions represent choices made by the litigants themselves. Now, there's also consideration of the availability of expertise that may have been on offer at the peripheries of court or the administration, which could have had an effect on the way that the contracts are then drawn up. So writers and legal advisors working for the administration, Roman soldiers who brought their own conventions, even new traders or travelers passing through the provinces and conveying different spheres of knowledge as they came, could all play a part in influencing the way that people conducted their legal transactions and the multiplicity of forms that were available. Knowledge of Greek language contracts and formulations don't come from nowhere, nor do they spring up overnight. And since they appear under the Roman administration, this is a likely place to find the expertise and possibly the paperwork involved in transmitting them, at least initially. And yet all of this also comes back to the individual. While the Roman court presence could and probably did have such far-reaching effects on the conduct of legal business, they were not universal, even within this small community and even within the sphere of the family. So let's not forget that Pleiadian 10 was written in the Roman era too, and seems to take no similar account of Roman preferences or envisage such a potential forum should problems arrive in the future. Now, this is significant and speaks to the plurality of options that were not only available to provincials in the area, but were actually employed. It also has interesting implications for the assessments of the provincialization or Romanization process, since it speaks to very different interactions with the Roman authorities, not just within the same province or even communities, but within the very same family. Babatha's marriage contract, with its apparent lack of concern for eventual possible recourse to the Roman authorities, represents quite a shift in attitude from that she seems to exhibit in her other transactions, which turn more and more to Greek. Her apparent willingness to approach the Roman court in her dispute with the guardians of her son Jesus is well documented, but she also conducts other business in Greek as well. So this sale and purchase or sharecropping arrangement of the date crop through the two Greek language contracts. And we also have Judah's influence being insufficient explanation for the choice of marriage contract, since he too also conducts business in Greek, even among his family members. So back to Pleiadian 17 again, and so on. The people of this community adapted, therefore, and reacted to the incoming Roman presence in many and various ways, with, if not quite a lack of consistency, then at least a high level of variation in how they chose to handle certain aspects of their legal lives. In all this, a constant topic of consideration must be the very practical choices being made on a day-to-day basis by the people involved, and that the documents were the result of a collaborative process in which different agents, capabilities, and understandings of legal technicalities met. Sometimes these understandings of law may have matched up, overlapped, or supplemented each other. Sometimes they conflicted, but each interaction between agents was in itself an exchange of knowledge, understandings, and ideas that could have more or less significant consequences for the way that a document could end up being drawn up. Furthermore, the consequences then go beyond that one papyrus, since the agents in question learn from their exchanges and bring their experience to the next transactions. In this, the provincials of Roman Arabia were not unusual. Indeed, they fit perfectly into our understandings of how subject peoples handled their legal transactions under Rome elsewhere, and engaged in very similar processes of interaction with their imperial overlords, processes which then end up in very individualized documents. But in the legal realm, we see a kind of provincial agency in action, even within what might be considered the most Roman of elements of Roman law. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Kim. Can everybody now hear me? Am I unmuted?
You are unmuted.
Great. Well, that was a tour de force, and I'm sure there'll be lots of questions. I already have 5 questions here from 7 different questioners, and perhaps may I kick off with something a little bit, just a little bit general. Is it right to say, Kim, to infer from your whole approach that these Jews, in spite of the growing corpus of Jewish law, behave as Roman provincials in, well, let's say just like provincials anywhere else, and that you can analyze their documentation, which is better than we have from most places, but you can analyze it on the same footing? Or would you rather say that there are very special factors here which have to be taken account of by us, and which indeed have to be taken account of by a provincial government then, if you see what I mean?
I do, yes. I'll try to split this up. So as to whether I think they're behaving as normal provincials, let's put it that way, or normal is the wrong word, as non-Jewish provincials would also behave in their legal transactions. Yes, I think they are. This is not to say that they're not using biblical law. For example, I mean, we can see Piyadin 18 is certainly a document according to a Jewish tradition of drawing up a ketubah. Now, this gets formulated later and redacted later in the Mishnah, so I wouldn't then use that later to sort of say they're abiding by later law. But I think that like any kind of a denial that there is a Jewish legal tradition to which they have knowledge of and can use when they want to, I would deny. However, that is one tool in many. And if we move, for example, to Egypt, and you can look at the way that provincials perhaps appeal to native custom, native tradition, and so on in other areas too, that is directly comparable and directly similar. So there might be different bodies of law to which you can appeal, different traditions to which they can appeal, but I think that we can understand their behavior and the way they're negotiating this in terms of exactly what provincials in general, as we would see for non-Jewish provincials as well. Now, the separate strand to this is whether there would then be a special position. Hannah, I can see your hands up. Would you like to come in? Like, rather, shall I hand over to you and then I can answer more? You're muted. You need to turn your microphone on.
You may need to mute Hannah. Unmute Hannah. Can you do it, Anthony?
No, I didn't want. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I didn't want to interrupt you, but I didn't know how to unmute. That's all. It was the only thing. Of course, I want to talk at some point, but I didn't mean to.
Oh, right, you don't want to. Okay, lovely.
That's
so
okay.
carry on, Kim, and we will, of course, give you space.
The separate question, which may need a bit more thought, is the attitude of the Roman authorities on this. Because there has, at least up to a point, been, well, at least up to 70, let's put it that way, a direct acknowledgement of Jews as a group who should be allowed to follow their own customs and are given privileges in that realm. But whether there is then, a kind of acknowledgement that actually, if you're appealing to Jewish tradition in a certain way, you would likely get that acknowledged more certainly by the Roman authorities, is a different question, one that I might have some sympathy for, though I will say that this doesn't seem to happen in documents that are directly aimed at the Roman governor in these archives. It's not like they ever appeal to, according to our law or according to our tradition within these documents, and use that. It's more that you can see in certain personal private transactions that they are indeed using Jewish legal traditions as well. So I think that two-pronged answer, which I hope is some sort of answer to your question.
Lovely, thanks. We have a question from Graham Morris. Are you able to do the unmuting, Anthony?
Yeah. I'm unmuted. You actually answered part of my original question, which was in what way does the ketubah that we have seen differ from the early Jewish law, probably even though we only have evidence probably a little later in the Mishnah, but you dealt with this extremely well. But I was fascinated by two aspects. One, there seems to be a receipt for a dowry, rather than, or maybe that there are receipts in rabbinic law or in Mishnah as well, but it doesn't, there isn't any reference to the obligation of the husband that appears in rabbinic law of 200 for a virgin wife, 100 for a widow. The other way around, which is not a dowry, which was common throughout, but not that obligation, which maybe was ordained later or not, and does it reflect on that practice? And the second question I wanted to ask is that I think it's Yehuda ben Hanania claims to be some sort of professional, because he signs himself librarios, which I imagine is like we see in rabbinic literature, lavlar, it's a Greek. So he obviously positions himself as some sort of a scribe, maybe very provincial and not he wouldn't pass as a scribe in Jerusalem. But he obviously seems to be claiming some professional status in this. Those were my two questions.
Thanks. Kim?
Thank you. Slightly breaking up, so I will answer as best as I can based on what I heard. So apologies if I miss something, and I'm very happy for people to email me afterwards, and then if I do miss something, then I can give a proper answer.
Thank you.
There was something, and this was where I was sort of breaking up a little bit about sort of the dowry and the amount of the dowry, and the amount that is stipulated in later rabbinic and in the Mishnaic regulations as well.
Whether there was a reciprocal obligation of the husband that you find in rabbinic law to that if in the event of divorce or death to pay a settlement figure.
There is obligation for maintenance of the wife, for example, after the dissolution of the marriage, which as you say, death or divorce as well. So we do find something like that there. What we also have with the librarios as well, and that this may be sort of related to the later rabbinic liblar. This is also possibly, there is a Roman sort of librarius, okay, which is again a kind of scribal, possibly scribal whatever, but it's a function within the army. So this does definitely look like, yes, they are, as you said, sort of professional expertise that is being advertised. What's unusual, and I hope I've heard these things correctly, what's unusual in these as well is that the scribes do actually sign their names and their titles, which we don't get that often in other documentation from the ancient world. So they are present and visible in a way that elsewhere they wouldn't be. So yeah, I can, as I said, I apologize in that some of this is breaking up, which may be my internet connection giving up the ghost. I'm not sure.
Have you got dreadful weather in Scotland or something?
Thank you. Thank you. You did answer. Thank you so much.
As I said, I am very happy to take questions by email as well if this doesn't work.
Please note everybody, and I'm sure your email is easily available on the Edinburgh University site. I think I probably ought to be strict and confine everybody to one question. Anthony Shepherd, do you want to pick what seems to be most immediate? There you are, and unmuted. I can unmute you, I think.
Sorry, I'm unmuted now. Yes, I will pick my second question. I think we've talked a good bit about the language question, but with reference to the two Greek language marriage contracts talked about, all the parties appear to be Jewish, judging from their names. Yeah. If that's correct, what's the implication of marriage under Greek law for kind of the position of Jewish-Gentile relations, or indeed the evolution of Jewish customs at the time?
Okay. So yes, they do seem to be Jewish. I'm not entirely sure that we can make much of of Jewish-Gentile relations from contracts like these, in the sense that there is definitely a decision that is being made to choose a Greek contract in this way. Now, sort of whether that doesn't really tell us anything about whether these particular Jews are sort of Hellenizing or anything else in other aspects of their life. Now, what we can say is that they seem fairly integrated into their community. As I said, sort of we have attestations of many relations with Romans, with Nabataeans, and so on as well. What it does say is that this particular group of Jews were indeed very willing to use Greek documentary forms in this particular private legal sphere. What you sort of make of that is something else entirely, and there may be something that then kind of works its way into later Jewish tradition. So I would be cautious about reading too much into this about kind of general lifestyle and cultural tendencies, but you can't write off that this is a deliberate choice to have these contracts written, as you say, by Jews who, for the most part, are completely illiterate in Greek, from what we can tell. Even though, as I said, there are sort of some technical terms to work their way into the Aramaic as well. But yet they go for these Greek language contracts, and there were other options available. So that's a sort of back and forth hedging your bets, in that I'm not entirely sure, but I think we can say a certain amount, but I wouldn't push it too far, if that makes sense.
Thank you. So may I myself will now just transmit for speed a few short questions, because I do want to leave a little space for Hannah to come in. And one is from Jonathan Feingold, simply saying, may I ask what the likely population of her village was? I take it that's Maoza.
Yeah, in all honesty, I'm not sure. And I think actually, Philip Esler, I think you have thought about this a bit harder than I have in some ways. I think of it as a kind of middle-sized village, though I wouldn't quantify it. Though you have worked on some of the economic terms and so on, that I think you probably assume that this is a slightly larger area than I initially did. And I'm coming around to your way of thinking that this is possibly, if we're thinking in quantification, if we're thinking in terms of modern quantifications, more of a town than a village, but it's labeled a village in antiquity because, you know, you have, it's a polis or it's a cormet, it's sort of, that's the label. And in terms of sort of very fixed figures, I don't know, I can't tell you kind of population of 30,000 or population of 5,000, I'm not sure. We do know that the same people pop up again and again. In terms of signing as witnesses, for example, which may suggest that there are a limited number of people around, at least who can perform this function. Now, that could just suggest that there are a small number of literates within the community who are willing to do this, and who are sort of sitting on the doorsteps, sitting on doorsteps somewhere and sort of offering to sign these documents professionally, possibly, or indeed that actually it's a small community and thus the same people pop up again and again.
Oh, great. That was actually very, very comprehensive answer in a very short space of time. David Shamash asks, I'll simplify, did Roman judges bother about Jewish tradition in those terms?
Okay, so bother as in they're not necessarily going to go out and find out all the details, investigate and become experts in Jewish law. What they might bother about is that, in the sense of an appeal to a long-standing tradition or custom, whether it's Jewish or otherwise, can have resonance in a Roman courtroom, for example, because it has an antiquity and it's old and it's a case on which to argue. But I wouldn't say that they are going around sort of desperately worried necessarily about sort of the niceties of Jewish law and Jewish tradition in a particular way, just as they wouldn't necessarily go in and investigate every single different tradition in Egyptian law. For example, we have appeals to the law of the Egyptians, which is fairly complicated. So there is an awareness that this exists. There may have been a written kind of document in that sense as well, but it's not as though Roman judges will then do thorough investigation. They'll rely on the evidence as presented and then on advisors as well, who can say yay or nay. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. That's beautifully clear. And now a rather nice observation from Jonathan Lewis, who says the relationship described between principals, litigants and their scribes seems to me to be analogous to that between principals / litigants and their lawyers today. I can see his point. Does that?
Yeah, in some ways, yes. There's a danger in thinking too much in modern legal terms because the infrastructure is not the same, and the professionalization of the legal profession is not quite the same, but it is developing at this point. So in the 2nd century, this is where actually this is beginning to change. But certainly, yes, that you can think in terms of sort of whether you would know how to draw up a particular contract or not, and then who you approach and what you say. That can be a helpful analogy to think of things.
Thank you. Well, we have 2 more questions have come in, but I'm going to, at this point, to hand over to Hannah next to ask or comment, interrogate Kim or comment as you see fit.
What do I have to do?
Just speak, Hannah. At the moment, I can hear you.
You don't have to if you don't want to, of course.
Gone. I think, Hannah, I think you're muted again.
Oh,
or my internet's going. I'm not sure which.
I can't unmute her. Can you unmute her, Anthony?
No.
Try again. Speak now, Hannah. No. Well, while perhaps you grapple with that, let me go to Virginia Withers. I'll ask them now, though I'd really like to have people's voices, but time is very short. And she asks about the papyri. Are they all of the same quality? Might they have been those written by professional scribes or included in a handbook be of better quality?
They are roughly the same quality. It doesn't seem to be hugely variable, though the handwriting varies a little bit between those who are sort of professional, others, and then the people subscribing them at the end. You can tell differences in that.
Great, thank you. And David Jacobson, interesting point here. Maybe you would like to put it. It's a double-barreled point. Where are you, David? Can he be unmuted, Anthony? Yeah.
Not by me.
Can we hear you?
David needs to unmute himself.
People can't, we can't do it for them. Okay.
Well, we can ask to unmute.
He's
That's
done
the same thing, really.
Yeah.
How do you...
Hi, Kim.
Hi.
Obviously, you talk at long last. I mean, as I'm concerned. I have a question, namely, there seems to be a paradox in this situation. Here you're describing a situation of legal documentation which was undertaken by Jews, among Jews as well, but indicating some sort of happy integration of Jews into Hellenistic and Roman milieu, down to, the private legalistic area. Yet, we have to remember that these documents were found in a Jewish revolutionary context, which was quite radical. I mean, there were Jews who didn't cooperate with Bar Kokhba. So can you please comment on this paradox?
It's a beautiful paradox, which in some ways is a mystery. My slightly cop-out answer to this is that these are legal and administrative documents which you would not necessarily find signs of tension in documents of this sort. Now, of course, what you could say is, okay, we would think that because someone is integrated does not necessarily mean that they have no dissatisfaction or opposition, is one first point, that you can be operating to the best of your abilities within the society and the legal context and imperial context that you have to, and particularly when you have a dispute where you are being forced to go to the Roman imperial authorities, you in some ways have absolutely no option but to look as though you conform, and indeed to conform if you want to have any chance of winning. So if you want to sort of get your business done, you're going to have to conform in certain ways in order to try to win. That doesn't necessarily mean that you're a perfectly happy person under Roman rule, or that you have sort of lovely fuzzy feelings towards the Roman imperial government and so on. So there is, in some ways, the type of documents that we've got are not necessarily going to give huge statements of opposition. Now, I appreciate that that doesn't in some ways solve the paradox, because you've still got a deliberate movement and a deliberate decision to then apparently join with these rebels and end up in these caves, which looks very, very odd in the context of what's gone before.
But also remember that the documents are
sorry,
not only
David, I don't...
legal about disputes, but personal marriage documents, which incorporate Greek tradition. That's what it says.
Yes.
And
David, I think time is awfully
the paradox is indeed very striking.
I think it is, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
No, I'd agree.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, that was a very nice broadening out again. And although we have an unusually mute Hannah, I've received a chat from her, which I'm sure we would all like to reject. She says, I really would like to express my penitentiary for the nonsense I have published.
Oh, for goodness sake, Hannah.
Hannah's now unmuted, so maybe she's
unmuted. Hannah,
may I say something?
Immediately.
Okay, I'd like to say something.
Okay, last word, and we should stop in 5 minutes because this has gone on much longer than usual.
Apologies.
Altogether nice, but people probably, carry on.
I've gone through a penitentia, penitence, and I understood that I have made grave mistakes. I haven't yet published them, the penitentia, but I have to say that I was confused by the label that Lewis gave the Greek documents. He called them marriage contracts.
Yeah.
In my ignorance and immaturity, I took it literally as really the documents which created the marriage, which they were not. Nothing. The people in the documents from the Judean Desert, although we would like to think differently, that they were liberal and free, etc., behaved the way the Jews behave now. Only the husband could write the ketubah in a marriage contract, and only the husband could give the divorce. These are two things that, well, I disputed about that, and I repented, of course. Only the husband can give the divorce. And as for the marriage contract, the Greek marriage contracts are financial settlements. They have nothing to do with the creation of the marriage. That was created by the ketubah. And it was almost, in fact, it was created by a previous stage called engagement, erusin.
Yeah.
In fact, if you want to break away from an engagement, you have to give a deed of divorce. In other words, the marriage is not the crucial legal state. The marriage, which is, we have erusin, betrothal, and we have marriage. And the marriage contracts in Greek are simply description of dowry and the obligations, etc., etc. But there is no way in which we should regard them as changing the legal situation. It's very nice to think of what is called now speech acts. A divorce is a speech act. Betrothal is a speech act. And it's much stronger than any writing and signatures. If a person says that to a woman in the presence of two witnesses, she becomes engaged. She needs a divorce. It is so strong, the speech act. And the same is true of the divorce. And this is something that I haven't known at all when I published the documents and when I wrote about them. The speech acts and the enormous light it pours on what happens in documents, which documents we possess and which ones we do not, etc., etc. Well, it has come to me too much late to write more than a penitentia. I haven't got around to it, but I will, I hope.
Well, that that was a very exciting and important statement, Kim. In brief.
No, that wonderful.
We need another session on this, obviously.
Hannah, when you write this, please send it to me. I would very much like to read it. And I agree with you in that much of what we're doing from this, and I'm quite glad now that I went for marriage-related contracts rather than marriage contracts, because this was also something that I was sort of looking at. But I think that one of the problems of studying this in antiquity is, of course, you say speech acts, but also oral tradition, orality, and that is vitally important even in legal, what we think of as legal terms and legal contracts as well, and we miss it. So yes, I would very gladly read this when you have written your Penitentia.
So would I. So thank you. And this goes in a sense to David's point as well, I think. It will have a relevance. On that note, I think probably a lot of people have had to go, but the hardcore of those who have an appetite for what is quite a challenging but absolutely fascinating subject are here to thank Kim very, very warmly with whatever kind of applause we can give for answering so many questions with such skill and patience. So, and let me just say, for those of you that are still here, we have another lecture this month, unusually on 26th of November, which is also, this one is, will bring in the participation of our Manchester contingent, and Jonathan Feingold is still here, and our colleague Joe Dweck will bring some invited guests in, and it is Charlotte Hempel, Why We Should Be Looking for Ezra's Legacy in the Dead Sea Scrolls. It more or less recaps a live lecture she has done for us, but many of you will not have heard it. Thank you again, Kim. Thank you, everybody, and goodbye.